Now we're going to take a look at the debate over TikTok and that the Trump administration's move to allow TikTok to temporarily continue to operate. Some have argued that Canada should ban the platform regardless of what the Trump administration does next. Columnist Adam Zivo joined us to unpack the argument.
TikTok is owned by a company named ByteDance, and both of these companies are incorporated in the Cayman Islands, yet both of them operate in China. And that's a problem because under the 2017 National Intelligence Law, any company that is operating in China can be easily compelled by Beijing to grant access to its data, which means that technically, under the current legal framework, Beijing can ask TikTok to provide any of the data that it has on hand. Now, TikTok has tried to argue that this data is not actually accessible by Beijing by saying that the data that, for example, exists on American users is stored in the United States. However, researchers have found evidence of backdoors that would still allow, the CCP to access this data if it really wanted to. Now, there are two broad buckets of security concerns around TikTok and its influence in the United States. So the first one is that people believe that TikTok poses a security risk because it gathers so much data around American users, and that can be provided to China and essentially function as a form of espionage. On the other hand, there are concerns that TikTok politicizes its content algorithm and promotes or demotes content based on whether it conforms to Beijing's geostrategic interests. Now, most of the conversation around TikTok situates these two concerns as being equally relevant, but actually it's the latter one, this politicized algorithm, that is far more concerning. And the reason for this is that though TikTok does gather a lot of data about its users, more so than most social media platforms, uh, its practices are still within industry norms, right? And so if China, for example, were to ask, TikTok to provide this data, you could get a lot of information about an average user, but no more so information than an advertiser could get, for example, from Facebook or let's say Twitter. Given the realities of global data markets, and given the fact that you can legally purchase much richer data from these third-party data brokers who benefit from lax regulations in the United States, are TikTok's data gathering practices as significant of a national security concern as some people would want to believe? And I and many others would argue that's not the case. So, in light of that, let's go to these politicized content recommendation algorithms. So the problem here is that TikTok doesn't allow any third party to see the insides of these algorithms. They're a black box. However, there was one firm that was able to estimate what kind of content is prioritized or deprioritized by measuring how many posts are associated with certain hashtags. Because TikTok doesn't publicly disclose the mechanics of its content recommendation algorithms, we can't know for sure whether these algorithms prioritize certain content based on the political goals of Beijing. Uh, we can't say that for certain. However, there was a 2023 study by the Network Cognition Research Institute, which found credible evidence that such politicization is occurring. And they were able to measure this by seeing how many posts were associated with certain hashtags across TikTok and Instagram. So essentially, if you look up a certain hashtag, let's say, for example, Taylor Swift, you'll see a certain number of posts associated with that hashtag, and you can get a certain sense of how many posts are associated with that subject matter more broadly. And for Instagram, it's about what, like 50% to twice as large in terms of its user base than TikTok. So presumably, if you were to look up the same hashtag on TikTok and Instagram, Instagram would have 1.5 to 2 times more posts. And what these researchers found was that for non-politically sensitive hashtags, uh, those hashtags actually conform to their expectations. So the pop culture hashtags that they searched had an Instagram to TikTok ratio of 2.2. So there was on average 2.2 more posts on Instagram than on TikTok. Geostrategically sensitive hashtags had highly unusual ratios. So, for example, the ratio for Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests was 181.1. What that means is that Instagram had 181 posts about Hong Kong's pro-democracy protests for every single post on TikTok. For Tiananmen Square, that ratio was 81.5. For Tibet, it was 37.7. And for Taiwan, it was 15.3. Now, these incredible ratios simply wouldn't be possible if there wasn't some manipulation going on in the algorithm. And this is why these researchers concluded that it was very likely that TikTok is promoting or demoting content based on Beijing's geostrategic interests. Now, this manipulation wasn't just contained to issues directly pertaining to China. These researchers also looked at a small number of hashtags pertaining to other geopolitical conflicts, and they found really strange ratios for Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for Iran's pro-democracy protests, and for the Kashmir independence movement. And so this suggests that TikTok heavily biased its algorithms in favor of Russia, Hamas, and the Iranian government, while undermining India, China's regional rival, by supporting the Kashmir independence movement, which was basically non-existent on Instagram. So from all of this, we can conclude that it is very likely that TikTok is a tool of information warfare that is being utilized by China to warp minds around the world so that they conform, not totally, but somewhat more conform to China's worldview. Now, unfortunately, other third-party researchers weren't able to replicate these results because days after the study was published, TikTok disabled the ability to search hashtags by post volume, at least in politically sensitive cases, citing misuse of this function. And I think that also speaks volumes. So if we can accept that TikTok is a weapon of information warfare, then why should any Western government allow it to be used within its territory? I mean, we don't allow our foreign adversaries to operate large state propaganda newspapers or, state propaganda TV channels within our borders. Why should we use a different standard with a social media platform which is obviously being misused?